Hey everybody, today we're going to be talking about the value of 16th notes and dotted notes. But before we do that, let's review the value of the notes that we have learned already. So the first note we have is a whole note. If you remember, a whole note is worth 4 beats. If we were going to split the whole note into 2 equal parts, we would need to divide 4 by 2, and so we get a value of 2. The note that is worth 2 beats is a half note, and it looks like this, a little open circle with a stem, and we could fit 2 half notes into 1 whole note. If we were going to divide one of these half notes into 2 equal parts, we would need 2 notes that are worth 1, because 1 plus 1 equals 2, and the note that is worth 1 is called a quarter note. So we can fit 2 quarter notes into 1 half note. That makes sense, right? We've got a quarter plus a quarter equals a half. So 4 quarter notes can fit into 1 whole note. Now, if I were going to divide one of these quarter notes into 2 equal parts, I would get a note that is worth a half a beat. This is an eighth note. An eighth note looks a lot like a quarter note, except it's got a little flag attached to it like this. Now, when we have 2 eighth notes together, a lot of the time we will beam them together so that they're a little bit easier to read as a group. So many times you'll see eighth notes grouped together like this, but that's still 2 eighth notes. So you could see them by themselves, or you might see them grouped together like this. Now, if we were going to take 1 eighth note and we were going to divide it into 2 equal parts, we would get what's called a 16th note. Technically, this is worth a quarter of a beat, but don't worry too much about that. The 16th note looks a lot like the 8th note, except we just add a second flag. So 2 16th notes could fit into 1 8th note, and 4 16th notes could fit into 1 quarter note. Now, just like the eighth notes, in order to make them a little bit easier to read, we like to group them together. But we need to add another beam to make sure that we can tell them apart from the eighth note. So an eighth note gets 1 beam, 16th notes get 2 beams, just like that. So we could fit 4 groups of 16th notes into 1 whole note. Now, if we were going to read all of these rhythms in time, within 4 beats, it would sound like this. Ta. That's a whole note. Let's try 2 half notes. Ta, ta. Let's try 4 quarter notes. Ta, 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 ta. Let's try 8 eighth notes. T, 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 T. Let's try 16 16th notes. Teary, 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 teary. Okay? That's how all of those notes fit in the same amount of beats. Now, of course, each of these notes has a corresponding rest of the same value. The whole rest looks like this. It's like a hole in the ground. You've got a line and then a black space, well, in this case red, underneath the line. It looks a lot like the half rest, but the half rest is the other way. It looks like a hat. That's probably the easiest way to remember it. The quarter rest looks like this. It's kind of like an E or a backwards 3 with a little kind of tail on the top. The eighth rest looks like a little 7 with a ball right at the end of it. And the 16th rest looks very similar to the 8th rest, except just like the note itself, we're going to add a little flag to it. Okay? So all of these rests are worth the same amount of beats as the notes that they correspond to. The only difference is that you will just rest or have silence for that same amount of time instead of playing a note. Now let's talk about dotted notes. There are 2 ways to think about what a dot does to a note. The first way is that it adds the value of the next fastest note. Let's look at a dotted half note as an example. Well, a half note is worth 2 beats. Now we need to add the value of the next fastest note. Well, the next fastest note is a quarter note. So we're going to add the value of a quarter note, which is 1, and 2 plus 1 is 3. So a dotted half note is worth 3 beats. There's another way to think about this, which gets the same answer, and that is that you add half the value of the original note. So let's take the same case as an example. In the case of a dotted half note, the original note is worth 2. Well, half of 2 is 1, so a dotted half note equals 3 beats. Okay? Let's look at another example. Let's try a dotted whole note. Well, a whole note is worth 4 beats. Now we need to add the value of the next fastest note. Well, the next fastest note from a whole note is a half note. So we're going to add the value of a half note, which is 2. If we were going to use the other method, we would just take half of 4, which gets us 2, the same answer. So the total value of a dotted whole note is 6 beats. Let's look at one more example using an image that I like, which involves cookies. So in this example, we have 2 different rhythms here. We have 4 quarter notes, which is 1, 2, 3, 4. Here we've got a dotted quarter note. Now, to see how many beats this has, we can think about it as adding half the value of the original note. Well, half of 1 cookie is half a cookie. So the value of a dotted quarter note is 1.5 cookies. Then, to finish the amount of beats that we need, what the composer did here is just add another half a cookie to make this sound better. Here's the difference. We have ta, 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 ta in the left example. On the right, we have ta, iti, ta, ta, cookie, cookie, cookie. Okay? So we've got a cookie and a half worth of sound here, half a cookie worth of sound here, and 2 full cookies here worth of sound. In other words, a dotted quarter note is worth 1.5 beats. Then we just added a half a beat to fill that extra space, and we've got a full beat plus a full beat here. All of that gets us to 4 total beats, which is the same as the one on the left. Okay, so that is dotted notes for you.